Chapter 11 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 2 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 11. Harper's Ferry. There now occurred another strange event which, if it had been specially designed as a climax for the series of great political sensations since 1852, could scarcely have been more dramatic. This was John Brown's invasion of Harper's Ferry in order to create a slave insurrection. We can only understand the transaction as far as we can understand the man, and both remain somewhat enigmatical. Of Puritan descent, John Brown was born in Connecticut in the year 1800. When he was 5 years old, the family moved to Ohio, at that time a comparative wilderness. Here he grew up a strong, vigorous boy of the woods. His father taught him the tanner's trade, but a restless disposition drove him to frequent changes of scene and effort when he grew to manhood. He attempted surveying. He became a divinity student. He tried farming and tanning in Pennsylvania, and tanning and speculating in real estate in Ohio. Cattle dealing was his next venture, from this to sheep raising, and by a natural transition to the business of a wool factor in Massachusetts. This not succeeding, he made a trip to Europe. Returning, he accepted from Gerrit Smith a tract of mountain land in the Adirondacks, where he proposed to found and foster colonies of free Negroes. This undertaking proved abortive, like all his others, and he once more went back to the wool business in Ohio. Twice married, 19 children had been born to him, of whom 11 were living when, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska bill plunged the country into the heat of political strife. 4 of his sons moved away to the new territory in the first rush of emigrants. Several others went later. When the border ruffian hostilities broke out, John Brown followed, with money and arms contributed in the North. With his sons as a nucleus, he gathered a little band of 15 to 20 adventurers, and soon made his name a terror in the lawless guerrilla warfare of the day. His fighting was of the prevailing type, justifiable, if at all, only on the score of defensive retaliation, and some of his acts were as criminal and atrocious as the worst of those committed by the border ruffians. His losses, 1 son murdered, another wounded to the death, and a third rendered insane from cruel treatment, are scarcely compensated by the transitory notoriety he gathered in a few foolhardy skirmishes. These varied experiences give us something of a clue to his character. A strong will, great physical energy, sanguine fanatical temperament, unbounded courage and little wisdom, crude visionary ideality, the inspiration of biblical precepts and Old Testament hero worship, and ambition curbed to irritation by the hard fetters of labor, privation, and enforced endurance. In association, habit, language, and conduct he was clean but coarse, honest but rude. In disposition he mingled the sacrificing tenderness with the sacrificial sternness of his prototypes in Jewish history. He could lay his own child on the altar without a pang. The strongest element of his character was religious fanaticism. Taught from earliest childhood to "fear God and keep His commandments," he believed firmly in the divine authenticity of the Bible, and memorized much of its contents. His favorite texts became literal and imperative mandates. He came to feel that he bore the commission and enjoyed the protection of the Almighty. In his Kansas camps he prayed and saw visions, believed he wielded the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, had faith that the angels encompassed him. He desired no other safeguard than his own ideas of justice and his own convictions of duty. These ideas and convictions, however, refused obedience to accepted laws and morals, and were mere fantastic and pernicious outgrowths of his religious fanaticism. His courage partook of the recklessness of insanity. He did not count odds. "What are 5 to 1?" he asked, and at another time he said, "One man in the right, ready to die, will chase 1,000." Perhaps he even believed he held a charmed life, for he boasted that he had been fired at 30 times and only his hair had been touched. In personal appearance he was tall and slender, with rather a military bearing. He had an impressive, half persuasive, half commanding manner. He was always very secretive, affected much mystery in movements, came and went abruptly, was direct and dogmatic to bluntness in his conversation. His education was scant, his reading limited. he wrote strong phrases in bad orthography. If we may believe the intimations from himself and those who knew him best, he had not only acquired a passionate hatred of the institution of slavery, but had for 20 years nursed the longing to become a liberator of slaves in the Southern States. To this end he read various stories of insurrections, and meditated on the vicissitudes, chances, and strategy of partisan warfare. A year's border fighting in Kansas not only suddenly put thought into action, but his personal and family sacrifices intensified his visionary ambition into a stern and inflexible purpose. It is impossible to trace exactly how and when the Harper's Ferry invasion first took practical shape in John Brown's mind, but the indications are that it grew little by little out of his Kansas experience. His earliest collisions with the border ruffians occurred the spring and summer of 1856. In the autumn of that year the United States troops dispersed his band and generally suppressed the Civil War. In January 1857 we find him in the Eastern States, appealing for arms and supplies to various committees and in various places, alleging that he desired to organize and equip a company of 100 minutemen who were "mixed up with the people of Kansas," but who should be ready on call to rush to the defense of freedom. This appeal only partly succeeded. From one committee he obtained authority as agent over certain arms stored in Iowa, the custody and control of which had been in dispute. From another committee he obtained a portion of the clothing he desired. From still other sources he received certain moneys, but not sufficient for his requirements. Two circumstances, however, indicate that he was practicing a deception upon the committees and public. He entered into a contract with a blacksmith in Collinsville, Connecticut, to manufacture him 1,000 pikes of a certain pattern to be completed in 90 days, and paid $550 on the contract. There is no record that he mentioned this matter to any committee. His proposed Kansas Minutemen were only to be 100 in number, and the pikes could not be for them. His explanation to the blacksmith that they would be a good weapon of defense for Kansas settlers was clearly a subterfuge. These pikes, ordered about March 23, 1857, were without doubt intended for his Virginia invasion, and in fact the identical lot, finished after long delay, under the same contract, were shipped to him in September, 1859, and were actually used in his Harper's Ferry attempt. The other circumstance is that, about the time of his contract for the pikes, he also, without the knowledge of committees or friends, engaged an adventurer named Forbes to go west and give military instruction to his company, a measure neither useful nor practicable for Kansas defense. These two acts may be taken as the first preparation for Harper's Ferry. But merely to conceive great enterprises is not to perform them, and every afterstep of John Brown reveals his lamentable weakness and utter inadequacy for the heroic role to which he fancied himself called. His first blunder was in divulging all his plans to Forbes, an utter stranger, while he was so careful in concealing them from others. Forbes, as ambitious and reckless as himself, of course soon quarreled with him, and left him, and endeavored first to supplant and then betray him. Meanwhile, little by little, Brown gathered 1 colored and 6 white Confederates from among his former followers in Kansas, and assembled them for drill and training in Iowa. 4 others joined him there. These, together with his son Owen, counted, all told, a band of 12 persons engaged for, and partly informed of, his purpose. He left them there for instruction during the first 3 months of the year 1858, while he himself went east to procure means. At the beginning of February 1858, John Brown became, and remained for about a month, a guest at the house of Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York. Immediately on his arrival there he wrote to a prominent Boston abolitionist, T.W. Higginson, "I now want to get, for the perfecting of by far the most important undertaking of my whole life, from $500 to $800 within the next 60 days. I have written Rev. Theodore Parker, George L. Stearns, and F.B. Sanborn, Esquires, on the subject." Correspondence and mutual requests for a conference ensued, and finally these Boston friends sent Sanborn to the house of Gerrit Smith in Peterborough, New York, where a meeting had been arranged. Sanborn was a young man of 26, just graduated from college, who, as secretary of various Massachusetts committees, had been the active agent for sending contributions to Kansas. He arrived on the evening of Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1858, and took part in a council of conspiracy, of which John Brown was the moving will and chief actor. Brown began by reading to the council a long document which he had drafted since his stay in Rochester. It called itself "A Provisional Constitution and Ordinances for the People of the United States," which, as it explained, looked to no overthrow of States or dissolution of the Union, but simply to amendment and repeal. It was not in any sense a reasonable project of government, but simply an ill-jointed outline of rules for a proposed slave insurrection. The scheme, so far as any comprehension of it may be gleaned from the various reports which remain, was something as follows. Somewhere in the Virginia mountains he would raise the standard of revolt and liberation. Enthusiasts would join him from the free States, and escaped blacks come to his help from Canada. From Virginia and the neighboring slave States of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, fugitive slaves with their families would flock to his camps. He would take his supplies, provisions, and horses by force from the neighboring plantations. Money, plate, watches, and jewelry would constitute a liberal safety or intelligence fund. For arms he had 200 Sharps rifles and 200 revolvers, with which he would arm his best marksmen. His ruder followers, and even the women and children, he would arm with pikes to defend the fortifications. He would construct defenses of palisades and earthworks. He would use natural strongholds, find secret mountain passes to connect one with another, retreat from and evade attacks he could not overcome. He would maintain and indefinitely prolong a guerrilla war, of which the Seminole Indians in Florida and the Negroes in Haiti afforded examples. With success, he would enlarge the area of his occupation so as to include arable valleys and lowlands bordering the Allegheny Range in the slave States, and here he would colonize, govern, and educate the blacks he had freed, and maintain their liberty. He would make captures and reprisals, confiscate property, take, hold, and exchange prisoners, and especially white hostages, and exchange them for slaves to liberate. He would recognize neutrals, make treaties, exercise humanity, prevent crime, repress immorality, and observe all established laws of war. Success would render his revolt permanent, and in the end, through amendment and repeal, abolish slavery. If, at the worst, he were driven from the mountains, he would retreat with his followers through the free States to Canada. He had 12 recruits drilling in Iowa, and a half-executed contract for 1,000 pikes in Connecticut. Furnish him $800 in money, and he would begin operations in May. This, if we supply continuity and arrangement to his vagaries, must have been approximately what he felt or dreamily saw, and outlined in vigorous words to his auditors. His listening friends were dumbfounded at the audacity as well as heartsick at the hopelessness of such an attempt. They pointed out the almost certainty of failure and destruction, and attempted to dissuade him from the mad scheme, but to no purpose. They saw they were dealing with a foregone conclusion. He had convoked them, not to advise as to methods, but to furnish the means. All reasonable argument he met with his rigid dogmatic formulas, his selected proverbs, his favorite texts of Scripture. The following, preserved by various witnesses as samples of his sayings at other times, indicate his reasoning on this occasion. "Give a slave a pike and you make him a man. I would not give Sharp's rifles to more than 10 men in 100, and then only when they have learned to use them. A ravine is better than a plain. Woods and mountain sides can be held by resolute men against 10 times their force." Nat Turner, with 50 men, held Virginia 5 weeks. The same number, well organized and armed, can shake the system out of the State. A few men in the right, and knowing they are right, can overturn a king. 20 men in the Alleghenies could break slavery to pieces in 2 years. If God be for us, who can be against us? Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. One of the participants relates that, when the agitated party broke up their council for the night, it was perfectly plain that Brown could not be held back from his purpose. The discussion of the friends on the second day, February 23rd, was therefore only whether they should aid him or oppose him, or remain indifferent. Against every admonition of reason, mere personal sympathy seems to have carried a decision in favor of the first of these alternatives. "You see how it is," said the chief counselor, Gerrit Smith. "Our dear old friend has made up his mind to this course and cannot be turned from it. We cannot give him up to die alone, we must support him." Brown has left an exact statement of his own motive and expectation in a letter to Sanborn on the following day. "I have only had this one opportunity in a life of nearly 60 years. God has honored but comparatively a very small part of mankind with any possible chance for such mighty and soul-satisfying rewards. I expect nothing but to endure hardness, but I expect to effect a mighty conquest, even though it be like the last victory of Samson." 9 days later Brown went to Boston, where the conspiracy was enlarged and strengthened by the promises and encouragements of a little coterie of radical abolitionists. Within the next 2 months the funds he desired were contributed and sent him. Meanwhile Brown returned West and moved his company of recruits from Iowa, by way of Chicago and Detroit, to the town of Chatham, in Canada West, arriving there about the 1st of May. By written invitations Brown here called together what is described as a quiet convention of the Friends of Freedom, to perfect his organization. On the 8th of May, 1858, they held a meeting with closed doors, there being present the original company of 10 or 11 white members and 1 colored, whom Brown had brought with him, and a somewhat miscellaneous gathering of Negro residents of Canada. Some sort of promise of secrecy was mutually made. Then John Brown, in a speech, laid his plan before the meeting. One Delaney, a colored doctor, in a response, promised the assistance of all the colored people in Canada. The provisional constitution drafted by Brown at Rochester was read and adopted by articles, and about 45 persons signed their names to the Constitution for the proscribed and oppressed races of the United States. 2 days afterwards the meeting again convened for the election of officers. John Brown was elected commander-in-chief by acclamation. Other members were by the same summary method appointed Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and 2 of them members of Congress. The election of a president was prudently postponed. This Chatham Convention cannot claim consideration as a serious deliberative proceeding. John Brown was its sole life and voice. The colored Canadians were nothing but spectators. The 10 white recruits were mere Kansas adventurers, mostly boys in years and waifs in society, perhaps depending largely for livelihood on the employment or bounty, precarious as it was, of their leader. Upon this reckless drifting material, the strong despotic will, emotional enthusiasm, and mysterious rhapsodical talk of John Brown exercised an irresistible fascination. He drew them by easy gradations into his confidence and conspiracy. The remaining element, John Brown's son in the Chatham meeting, and other sons and relatives in the Harper's Ferry attack, are of course but the long-educated instruments of the father's thought and purpose. With funds provided, with his plan of government accepted, and himself formally appointed commander-in-chief, Brown doubtless thought his campaign about to begin. It was, however, destined to an unexpected interruption. The discarded and disappointed adventurer Forbes had informed several prominent Republicans in Washington City that Brown was meditating an unlawful enterprise, and the Boston committee, warned that certain arms in Brown's custody, which had been contributed for Kansas defense, were about to be flagrantly misused, dared not incur the public odium of complicity in such a deception and breach of faith. The Chatham organization was scarcely completed when Brown received word from the Boston committee that he must not use the arms, the 200 Sharps rifles and 200 revolvers, which had been entrusted to him for any other purpose than for the defense of Kansas. Brown hurried to Boston, but oral consultation with his friends confirmed the necessity for postponement, and it was arranged that, to lull suspicion, he should return to Kansas and await a more favorable opportunity. He yielded assent, and that fall and winter performed the exploit of leading an armed foray into Missouri, and carrying away 11 slaves to Canada, an achievement which, while to a certain degree it placed him in the attitude of a public outlaw, nevertheless greatly increased his own and his followers' confidence in the success of his general plan. Gradually the various obstacles melted away. Kansas became pacified. The adventurer Forbes faded out of sight and importance. The disputed Sharps rifles and revolvers were transferred from committee to committee, and finally turned over to a private individual to satisfy a debt. He in turn delivered them to Brown without any hampering conditions. The Connecticut blacksmith finished and shipped the 1,000 pikes. The contributions from the Boston committee swelled from $1 to several thousands of dollars. The recruits, with a few changes, though scattered in various parts of the country, were generally held to their organization and promise, and slightly increased in number. The provisional constitution and sundry blank commissions were surreptitiously printed, and captains and lieutenants appointed by the signature of John Brown, Commander in Chief, countersigned by the Secretary of War. Gradually also the Commander in Chief resolved on an important modification of his plan, that, instead of plunging at once into the Virginia mountains, he would begin by the capture of the United States Armory and Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Two advantages seem to have vaguely suggested themselves to his mind as likely to arise from this course: the possession of a large quantity of government arms, and the widespread panic and moral influence of so bold an attempt. But it nowhere appears that he had any conception of the increased risk and danger it involved, or that he adopted the slightest precaution to meet them. Harper's Ferry was a town of 5,000 inhabitants, lying between the slave states of Maryland and Virginia, at the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, where the united streams flow through a picturesque gap in the single mountain range called the Blue Ridge. The situation possesses none of the elements which would make it a defensible fastness for protracted guerrilla warfare, such as was contemplated in Brown's plan. The mountains are everywhere approachable without difficulty, are pierced by roads and farms in all directions, contain few natural resources for sustenance, defense, or concealment, are easily observed or controlled from the plain by superior forces. The town is irregular, compact, and hilly. A bridge across each stream connects it with the opposite shores, and the government factory and buildings, which utilized the water power of the Potomac, lay in the lowest part of the point of land between the streams. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad crosses the Potomac Bridge. On the 4th of July, 1859, John Brown, under an assumed name, with 2 sons and another follower, appeared near Harper's Ferry, and soon after rented the Kennedy farm in Maryland, 5 miles from town, where he made a pretense of cattle dealing and mining, but in reality collected secretly his rifles, revolvers, ammunition, pikes, blankets, tents, and miscellaneous articles for a campaign. His rather eccentric actions, and the irregular coming and going of occasional strangers at his cabin, created no suspicion in the neighborhood. Cautiously increasing his supplies, and gathering his recruits, he appointed the attack for the 24th of October, but for some unexplained reason, fear of treachery it is vaguely suggested, he precipitated his movement in advance of that date. From this point the occurrences exhibit no foresight or completeness of preparation, no diligent pursuit of an intelligent plan, nor skill to devise momentary expedients, only a blind impulse to act. On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, Brown gave his final orders, humanely directing his men to take no life where they could avoid it. Placing a few pikes and other implements in his one-horse wagon, he started with his company of 18 followers at 8 o'clock in the evening, leaving 5 men behind. They cut the telegraph wires on the way, and reached Harper's Ferry about 11 o'clock. He himself broke open the armory gates, took the watchmen prisoners, and made that place his headquarters. Separating his men into small detachments, he took possession of, and attempted to hold, the 2 bridges, the arsenal, and the rifle factory. Next he sent 6 of his men 5 miles into the country to bring in several prominent slave owners and their slaves. This was accomplished before daylight, and all were brought as prisoners to Brown at the armory. With them they also brought a large 4-horse farm wagon, which he now sent to transfer arms from the Kennedy farm to a schoolhouse on the Maryland side of the Potomac, about 1 mile from the town. Meanwhile, about midnight of Sunday, they detained the railroad train 3 hours, but finally allowed it to proceed. A Negro porter was shot on the bridge. The town began to be alarmed. Citizens were captured at various points, and brought to swell the number of prisoners at the armory, counting 40 or 50 by morning. Still, not until daylight, and even until the usual hour of rising on Monday morning, did the town comprehend the nature and extent of the trouble. What now did Brown intend to do? What result did he look for from his movement thus far? Amid his conflicting acts and contradictory explanations, the indications seem clear only on 2 or 3 points. Both he and his men gave everybody to understand without reserve that they had come not to kill whites, but only to liberate slaves. Soon, also, he placed pikes in the hands of his black prisoners. But that ceremony did not make soldiers of them, as his favorite maxim taught. They held them in their hands with listless indifference, remaining themselves, as before, an encumbrance instead of a reinforcement. He gave his white prisoners notice that he would hold them as hostages, and informed one or two that, after daylight, he would exchange them for slaves. Before the general fighting began, he endeavored to effect an armistice or compromise with the citizens, to stop bloodshed, on condition that he be permitted to hold the armory and retain the liberated negroes. All this warrants the inference that he expected to hold the town, first, by the effect of terror, secondly, by the display of leniency and kindness, and supposed that he could remain indefinitely, and dictate terms at his leisure. The fallacy of this scheme became quickly apparent. As the day dawned upon the town and the truth upon the citizens, his situation in a military point of view was already hopeless. 18 men against perhaps 1,000 adults, and these 18 scattered in 4 or 5 different squads, without means of mutual support, communication, or even contingent orders. Gradually, as the startled citizens became certain of the insignificant numbers of the assailants, an irregular street firing broke out between Brown's sentinels and individuals with firearms. The alarm was carried to neighboring towns, and killed and wounded on both sides augmented the excitement. Tradition, rather than definite record, asserts that some of Brown's lieutenants began to comprehend that they were in a trap, and advised him to retreat. Nearly all his eulogists have assumed that such was his original plan, and his own subsequent excuses hint at this intention. But the claim is clearly untenable. He had no means of defensive retreat, no provisions, no transportation for his arms and equipage, no supply of ammunition. The suggestion is an evident afterthought. Whether from choice or necessity, however, he remained only to find himself more and more closely pressed. By Monday noon the squad in the rifle works, distant 1 mile from the armory, had been driven out, killed, and captured. The other squads, not so far from their leader, joined him at the armory, minus their losses. Already he was driven to take refuge with his diminished force in the engine house, a low, strong brick building in the armory yard, where they barricaded doors and improvised loopholes, and into which they took with them 10 selected prisoners as hostages. But the expedient was one of desperation. By this movement Brown literally shut himself up in his own prison, from which escape was impossible. A desultory fire was kept up through doors and loopholes, but now the whole country had become thoroughly aroused, and sundry military companies from neighboring towns and counties poured into Harper's Ferry. Brown himself at length realized the hopelessness of his position, and parleyed for leave to retreat across the river on condition of his giving up his prisoners, but it was too late. President Buchanan also took prompt measures, and on Monday night a detachment of 80 Marines from the Washington Navy Yard, under the command of Brevet Colonel Robert E. Lee of the United States Army, the same who afterwards became the principal leader of the Confederate armies in the rebellion, reached the scene of action, and were stationed in the armory yard so as to cut off the insurgents from all retreat. At daylight on Tuesday morning Brown was summoned to surrender at discretion, but he refused. The instant the officer left the engine house, a storming party of Marines battered in the doors. In 5 minutes the conflict was over. 1 Marine was shot dead in the assault. Brown fell under severe sword and bayonet wounds. 2 of his sons lay dead or dying, and 4 or 5 of his men were made prisoners, only 2 remaining unhurt. The great scheme of liberation, built up through nearly 3 years of elaborate conspiracy, and designed to be executed in defiance of law by individual enterprise with pikes, rifles, forts, guerrilla war, prisoners, hostages, and plunder, was, after an experimental campaign of 36 hours, in utter collapse. Of Brown's total force of 22 men, 10 were killed, 5 escaped, and 7 were captured, tried, and hanged. Of the townspeople, 5 had been killed and 8 wounded. While John Brown's ability for military leadership was too insignificant even for comment, his moral and personal courage compelled the admiration of his enemies. Arraigned before a Virginia court, the authorities hurried through his trial for treason, conspiracy, and murder with an unseemly precipitancy, almost calculated to make him seem the accuser and the Commonwealth the trembling culprit. He acknowledged his acts with frankness, defended his purpose with a sincerity that betokened honest conviction, bore his wounds, and met his fate with a manly fortitude. 8 years before he had written in a document organizing a band of colored people in Springfield, Massachusetts, to resist the fugitive slave law, "Nothing so charms the American people as personal bravery." The trial for life of one bold and to some extent successful man, for defending his rights in good earnest, would arouse more sympathy throughout the nation than the accumulated wrongs and sufferings of more than 3 millions of our submissive colored population. Even now, when mere quixotic knight errantry and his own positive violation of the rights of individuals and society had put his life in forfeit, this sympathy for his boldness and misfortune came to him in large measure. Questioned by Governor Wise, Senator Mason, and Representative Vallandigham about his accomplices, he refused to say anything except about what he had done, and freely took upon himself the whole responsibility. He was so warped by his religious training as to have become a fatalist as well as a fanatic. "All our actions," he said to one who visited him in prison, "even all the follies that led to this disaster were decreed to happen ages before the world was made." Perverted Calvinistic philosophy is the key which unlocks the mystery of Brown's life and deeds. He was convicted, sentenced, and hanged on the 2nd of December. Congress met a few days afterwards, and the Senate appointed an investigating committee to inquire into the seizure of the United States Armory and Arsenal. The long and searching examination of many witnesses brought out with sufficient distinctness the varied personal plottings of Brown, but failed to reveal that half a dozen radical abolition clergymen of Boston were party to the conspiracy; nor did they then or afterwards justify their own conduct by showing that Christ ever counseled treason, abetted conspiracy, or led rebellion against established government. From beginning to end the whole act was reprehensible and fraught with evil result. Modern civilization and republican government require that beyond the self-defense necessary to the protection of life and limb, all coercive reforms shall act by authority of law only. Upon politics the main effect of the Harper's Ferry incident was to aggravate the temper and increase the bitterness of all parties. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, Mason of Virginia, and Fitch of Indiana, Democratic members of the Senate investigating committee, sought diligently but unsuccessfully to find grounds to hold the Republican party at large responsible for Brown's raid. They felt obliged to report that they could not recommend any legislation to meet similar cases in the future, since the invasion of Virginia was not of the kind mentioned in the Constitution, but was simply the act of lawless ruffians, under the sanction of no public or political authority. Collamer of Vermont and Doolittle of Wisconsin, Republican members of the committee, in their minority report, considered the affair an outgrowth of the pro-slavery lawlessness in Kansas. Senator Douglas of Illinois, however, apparently with the object of still further setting himself right with the South, and atoning for his Freeport heresy, made a long speech in advocacy of a law to punish conspiracies in one state or territory against the government, people, or property of another, once more quoting Lincoln's Springfield speech and Seward's Rochester speech as containing revolutionary doctrines. In the country at large, as in Congress, the John Brown raid excited bitter discussion and radically diverse comment, some execrating him as a deservedly punished felon, while others exalted him as a saint. His Boston friends particularly, who had encouraged him with voice or money, were extravagant in their demonstrations of approval and admiration. On the day of his execution religious services were held and funeral bells were tolled. "The road to heaven," said Theodore Parker, "is as short from the gallows as from a throne, perhaps also as easy." "Some 1800 years ago," said Thoreau, "Christ was crucified. This morning, perchance, Captain Brown was hung. These are the two ends of a chain which is not without its links." Emerson, using a yet stronger figure, had already called him a new saint, waiting yet his martyrdom, and who, if he shall suffer, will make the gallows glorious like the cross. Amid this conflict of argument, public opinion in the free States gravitated to neither extreme. It accepted neither the declaration of the great orator Wendell Phillips that "the lesson of the hour is insurrection," nor the assertion of the great lawyer Charles O'Connor that slavery is in its own nature as an institution beneficial to both races. This chapter would be incomplete if we neglected to quote Mr. Lincoln's opinion of the Harper's Ferry attempt. His quiet and common sense criticism of the affair, pronounced a few months after its occurrence, was substantially the conclusion to which the average public judgment has come after the lapse of a quarter of a century. Slave insurrections are no more common now than they were before the Republican party was organized. What induced the Southampton insurrection 28 years ago, in which at least 3 times as many lives were lost as at Harper's Ferry? You can scarcely stretch your very elastic fancy to the conclusion that Southampton was "got up by black republicanism." In the present state of things in the United States, I do not think a general or even a very extensive slave insurrection is possible. The indispensable concert of action cannot be attained. The slaves have no means of rapid communication, nor can incendiary freemen, black or white, supply it. The explosive materials are everywhere in parcels, but there neither are nor can be supplied the indispensable connecting trains. Much is said by Southern people about the affection of slaves for their masters and mistresses, and part of it at least is true. A plot for an uprising could scarcely be devised and communicated to 20 individuals before some one of them, to save the life of a favorite master or mistress, would divulge it. This is the rule, and the slave revolution in Haiti was not an exception to it, but a case occurring under peculiar circumstances. The gunpowder plot of British history, though not conducted with slaves, was more in point. In that case only about 20 were admitted to the secret, and yet one of them, in his anxiety to save a friend, betrayed the plot to that friend, and, by consequence, averted the calamity. Occasional poisonings from the kitchen, and open or stealthy assassinations in the field, and local revolts extending to a score or so, will continue to occur as the natural results of slavery, but no general insurrection of slaves, as I think, can happen in this country for a long time. Whoever much fears or much hopes for such an event will be alike disappointed. John Brown's effort was peculiar. It was not a slave insurrection. It was an attempt by white men to get up a revolt among slaves, in which the slaves refused to participate. In fact, it was so absurd that the slaves, with all their ignorance, saw plainly enough it could not succeed. That affair, in its philosophy, corresponds with the many attempts related in history at the assassination of kings and emperors. An enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by Heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt, which ends in little else than his own execution. Orsini's attempt on Louis Napoleon and John Brown's attempt at Harper's Ferry were, in their philosophy, precisely the same. The eagerness to cast blame on Old England in the one case, and on New England in the other, does not disprove the sameness of the two things. The aggravation of partisan temper over the Harper's Ferry incident found a manifestation in a contest over the speakership in the House of Representatives as prolonged and bitter as that which attended the election of Banks. In the congressional elections of 1858, following the Lecompton controversy, the Democrats had once more lost control of the House of Representatives, there having been chosen 113 Republicans, 93 Administration Democrats, 8 anti-Lecompton Democrats, and 23 South Americans, as they were called, that is, members mainly from the slave states, opposed to the administration. This 36th Congress began its session 3 days after the execution of John Brown, and the election of a speaker was the first work of the new House of Representatives. The Republicans, not having a majority, made no caucus nomination, but John Sherman of Ohio had the largest following on the first ballot, and thereafter received their united efforts to elect him. At this point a Missouri member introduced a resolution declaring that the doctrines and sentiments of a certain book called The Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It, purporting to have been written by one Hinton R. Harper of North Carolina, are insurrectionary and hostile to the domestic peace and tranquillity of the country, and that no member of this House who has endorsed and recommended it, or the compend from it, is fit to be Speaker of this House. This resolution was aimed at Sherman, who with some 70 Republicans of the previous Congress had signed a circular endorsing and recommending the book upon the general statement that it was an anti-slavery work written by a Southerner. The book addressed itself to non-slave holding Southern whites, and was mainly made up of statistics, but contained occasional passages of intolerant and vindictive sentiment against slaveholders. Whether it could be considered insurrectionary depended altogether on the pro-slavery or anti-slavery bias of the critic. Besides, the author had agreed that the obnoxious passages should not be printed in the compendium which the Republicans recommended in their circular. When interrogated, Mr. Sherman replied that he had never seen the book, and that "I am opposed to any interference whatever by the people of the free states with the relations of master and slave in the slave states." But the disavowal did not relieve him from Southern enmity. The fire eaters seized the pretext to charge him with all manner of abolition intentions, and by violent debate and the utterance of threats of disunion, made the House a parliamentary and almost a revolutionary Babel for nearly 2 months. Certain appropriations were exhausted, and the Treasury was in great need of funds. Efforts were made to adopt the plurality rule and to choose a Speaker for a limited period, but every such movement was resisted for the purpose of defeating Sherman, or rather through his defeat to force the North into unconditional submission to extreme pro-slavery sentiment. The struggle, nominally over an incident, was in reality over a policy. On January 30th, 1860, Mr. Sherman withdrew his name, and the solid Republican vote was given to William Pennington of New Jersey, another Republican, who, on February 1st, was elected Speaker by 117 votes, 4 opposing members having come to his support. The South gained nothing by the obstructionist policy of its members. During the long contest, extending through 44 ballots, their votes were scattered among many candidates of different factions, while the Republicans maintained an almost unbroken steadiness of party discipline. On the whole, the principal results of the struggle were to sectionalize parties more completely, ripen Southern sentiment towards secession, and combine wavering voters in the free States in support of Republican doctrines. End of chapter 11. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.